On a cold morning in the year 1221, on a flat plain south of the Aral Sea, a Persian general named Jalal ad-Din looked out across the steppe at dawn and saw something that, by every rule of the warfare he had been trained in, should have been impossible. The Mongol army that had been pursuing him for 3 weeks was in full retreat, riding away across the grassland in disorder, abandoning supplies, leaving wounded behind, breaking apart visibly in the morning light. He gave the order to pursue. His cavalry rode after them at full gallop. And 4 hours later, when they had chased the fleeing Mongols deep into a shallow valley they had never seen before, the trap closed behind them, and 90% of his army was dead by sunset. The Mongols did not have better weapons than the civilizations they conquered. They did not have better armor. They did not have larger armies. By every conventional measure, the empires they destroyed, Khwarezm, Jin China, the Abbasid Caliphate, Kievan Rus, should have crushed them within months. But the Mongols had something else. A single tactic, perfected over generations on the open steppe, that worked on almost every enemy they ever fought, and that, in the span of about 70 years, allowed them to build the largest contiguous land empire in history and kill, by the most credible modern estimates, somewhere between 30 and 60 million people, about 1 in every 10 human beings alive on Earth at the time. And the strangest thing about this tactic is that it was not a weapon. It was a lie. To understand how a single battlefield trick could enable the destruction of an entire civilization, you have to begin not with the trick itself, but with the man who refined it, a man who was born sometime around the year 1162, in a tent on the Mongolian steppe, to a minor tribal chief who would be poisoned to death before his son turned 10, leaving the boy and his mother to survive on roots and fish in a country where the temperature dropped to -40 in winter. The boy's name was Temujin. He was born holding, according to the legend his followers later told, a clot of blood in his fist, an omen that meant, in the steppe culture of his time, that he would grow up to be a warrior. And by the standards of any reasonable observer who would have met him as a child, this prediction would have seemed absurd. His father was dead. His tribe had abandoned his family to die. He spent his teenage years as a fugitive, hunted by rival clans, hiding in the mountains, occasionally captured and held in a wooden yoke around his neck. Most boys in his position did not live to see 20. Temujin lived. And by the time he was 40 years old, he had unified the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe under a single banner for the first time in their history, and his followers had given him a new title, Genghis Khan, which means, approximately, the universal ruler. What he had done in those 40 years was not strange in any one detail. The Mongols had always been good horsemen. They had always been good archers. They had always fought from the saddle, with composite bows that they could draw and release at full gallop, with arrows that could pierce armor at 200 paces. None of this was new. What was new was that, under Temujin, all of the steppe tribes were fighting together, instead of fighting each other, and that they were doing it according to a single coordinated military doctrine, which had been refined by the Khan and his generals into the most efficient killing machine the medieval world had ever produced. And at the heart of that doctrine, the technique that worked over and over again on enemy after enemy, in country after country, for 70 years, was a deliberate, calculated, repeatedly successful battlefield lie. The Mongols called it the feigned flight. In modern military terminology, it is sometimes called the false retreat, or the controlled withdrawal, or the encirclement maneuver. By any name, the tactic worked like this. A small Mongol force, usually a few thousand riders, sometimes fewer, would engage an enemy army at the front of a battle, fight just hard enough to make the engagement seem real, and then, at a signal that was almost always prearranged, would break and ride away in apparent panic. The retreat looked, to the enemy commander watching it happen, exactly like a defeat. Mongol horsemen would scatter visibly. Some would drop weapons or shields, deliberately, as if they were too frightened to think. Some would ride at angles to each other, simulating the disorganized flight of a broken unit. Wounded men would be left behind to be captured. And the enemy commander, almost without exception, would order his cavalry to pursue. This was the moment the trap closed. Because the retreating Mongols were not retreating. They were leading the pursuing force, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, into terrain that the Mongol commanders had already scouted, usually a valley with steep sides, or a flat plain where a hidden second force was waiting in concealment, or a riverbank where the enemy cavalry would find itself with water at its back and Mongol archers on three sides. The pursuing force, by the time it arrived, would be exhausted, strung out over kilometers, separated from its infantry support, and unable to maintain formation. And then the Mongol main force, which had never been retreating in the first place, would emerge from cover, and the false retreat unit would turn back to fight, and the enemy cavalry would be surrounded on every side by archers who could pour arrows into them at a rate of 12 shots per minute, and the engagement would be over in an hour. The Mongols used this tactic against the Jin Chinese. They used it against the Khwarezmian Persians. They used it against the Russians at the Khalkha River. They used it against the Hungarians at Mohi. They used it against the Polish-German coalition at Legnica. They used it, with very minor variations, in almost every major engagement of their 7-decade campaign of conquest, and it worked, with very few exceptions, every single time. But the false retreat was not just a battlefield tactic. It was the door through which the Mongol Empire walked into the most prosperous civilization of the medieval Islamic world. And what happened to that civilization, in the 5 years after they walked through that door, has no equivalent in any other event in recorded human history. In the year 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade delegation to the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Persian-speaking civilization that controlled most of what is now Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, with a population of perhaps 5 million people and an army numbering between 200,000 and 400,000. The trade delegation arrived at the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar. The local governor accused them of being spies and ordered them executed. The Khan sent a second envoy to demand justice. The Khwarezmian emperor had that envoy beheaded as well. What happened next is one of the moments in history when a single decision sets in motion a sequence of events so disproportionate to its cause that historians, looking back, can only describe it as a kind of slow-motion catastrophe. Genghis Khan personally led an army of about 200,000 into Khwarezmian territory. Within 5 years, the empire of Khwarezm had ceased to exist. Its capital city, Samarkand, one of the most beautiful cities of the medieval world, with marble palaces, irrigation gardens, libraries, and a university, was sacked, its population either killed or enslaved. The city of Nishapur, in northeastern Iran, was so thoroughly destroyed that the Mongol soldiers were ordered to behead every inhabitant, including women, children, and animals, and to stack the skulls in 3 pyramids in the central square. The pyramids stood for years. The city of Merv, which had been one of the largest cities on earth, possibly larger than any contemporary European city, was burned, its irrigation system destroyed, and its survivors, according to the medieval Persian historian Juvayni, killed at a rate of 300 to 400 per soldier over a period of several days. Modern scholars consider these numbers exaggerated. They are still horrifying. By 1223, the entire Eastern Islamic world had been depopulated on a scale that the historian Adam-Malik Juvayni, writing only a generation later, with access to survivors and to the few remaining records, described in language that has survived to this day. They came, the historian wrote, they ransacked, they slew, they burned, they carried away. And from this catastrophe, he added, the world will not recover for 1,000 years. The total death toll of the Mongol conquests has been estimated by demographic historians using comparative population records before and after the campaigns, at somewhere between 30 and 60 million people, with most modern estimates settling near the higher end of that range. To put that figure in context, the world population in 1220 was probably around 360 million. The Mongol conquests, in other words, killed between 8 and 17% of every human being alive on Earth at the time. The province of Hunan, in northern China, lost approximately 90% of its population during the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty, a die-off comparable, in proportional terms, to the Black Death that would sweep Europe a century later. Persia lost an estimated 3/4 of its population. Hungary lost half. The cities of Central Asia lost almost everyone. And the strangest fact about this catastrophe is that the tactic that made it possible, the false retreat, the controlled withdrawal, the lie that drew enemy armies into ambushes they could not survive, was not technologically advanced. It did not require gunpowder, which the Mongols had. It did not require cavalry that was faster than enemy cavalry, which it sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. It required only one thing: discipline. Discipline strict enough that thousands of horsemen could ride away from a battle in apparent panic, on a signal, with no man breaking rank to actually flee, with no rider losing track of the rendezvous point, with no unit forgetting that the retreat was only acting. And then, on a second signal, all of those same thousands of horsemen could turn and re-engage at full strength. It is one of the harder things in any military culture to train an army to do. The Mongols spent their childhoods on horseback, hunting in coordinated groups across the open steppe, where this kind of coordinated maneuver was a survival skill, not a tactic. They learned to feign flight before they learned to read. And against an opponent who had not been trained the same way, a Persian feudal lord, a Chinese imperial general, a European knight whose code of honor required him to charge any enemy who appeared to be running, it worked, again and again, for 70 years. The Mongol Empire, at its greatest extent, covered 24 million square kilometers, from the Pacific coast of Korea to the Black Sea. It collapsed within 150 years of Genghis Khan's death, broken apart by succession disputes among his descendants. The cities it destroyed mostly remained destroyed. The irrigation systems of Persia were not rebuilt for centuries. The population of northern China did not return to pre-conquest levels until the 17th century. And the tactic that built it, the small, disciplined lie of a false retreat, perfected over generations on the empty grass of the Mongolian steppe, outlived the empire. Versions of the same trick appear in nearly every successful cavalry campaign of the medieval and early modern world, from the Ottoman conquests to the Polish Hussars to the campaigns of the American Civil War. But the original, the one that drew Jalal ad-Din into a valley he had never seen, that emptied the cities of Khwarazm, that killed 1 in every 10 people on earth, has only ever been done that well, on that scale, by one civilization in human history. This has been Hidden History Vault. The past never stops speaking.